what can games render to the philosophies of fiction that other practices can't? Ivan and I have regularly been returning to this question in conversation from our different fields. He as literary theorist and me as game studies scholar. And both of us in an awareness of the role that continental philosophy might play in any response. We zeroed in on this topic due to our shared interest in the seeming compulsion users of various media forms have to transporting themselves to fictional worlds. This is both in terms of the urge to engage with the fictional, but also in the process of the transportation as it offers itself as an unreflected and reflected experience. The questions that seem central are therefore, what draws the mind to fiction? Do games offer a distinct set of affordances for engagement with fiction that sets them apart from other media? Addressing the latter, we started off by looking at how the nature of fiction is treated within game studies, particularly within the work of Jesper Juul, Espen Aarseth, and Grant Tavinor. Fictionality is a core part of Juul's conception of games and half real. Games are, he says, half rules and half fiction. Real rules and fiction, to be more exact. Here he frames fiction in terms of differentiation between the simulated and representational space. The space of a game is part of the world in which it is played, but the space of a fiction is outside of the world in which it is created. Aarseth, for his part, argues outright against viewing games as fiction. He posits them instead as a third ontological category, simulation, that lies between real and the fictional. Aarseth bases his claim for an ontological distinction between fiction and simulation on the distinction in his earlier work between ergodic and non-ergodic media, namely that non-ergodic media feature only representational elements, while ergodic media feature both representational elements and machining structures that animate them. Okay? And there's this underlying structure to simulations that goes beyond the simple, but the more limited viewer and sign kind of relationship. Thus, his example, he uses small from Lord of the Rings. A dragon in a game has properties as various kinds of properties, both in terms of its place within the environment and also physical properties that a dragon Smog in a novel might not have. Tavinor has written 2 papers that critique Aarseth's position. His argument is rooted in the basic assertion that since games are representational media, featuring unreal worlds, characters and events, they are not real, fictional. And he defines fictional as a work of fiction as one in which the characters, places, events, objects and actions referred to are fictional rather than real. And he posits a strong and weak thesis of fiction and tries to defend both. This reasserts conceptions of fiction prevalent in analytical philosophy that focus on the ontological status of an element and often pitches the relation of fiction with its binary opposite, the real. To us, however, it seemed that it might be problematic to leave the corresponding question of the real unaddressed. So we looked at other thinking elsewhere. Richard Walsh, for example, in his Rhetoric of Fictionality, argues that fictionality functions within a communicative framework. It resides in a way of using language, and its distinctiveness consists in recognizably distinct rhetorical set invoked by that use. And importantly, if fictionality consists in a distinct way of using language, it is not explained by attaching its distinctiveness to some quarantine mechanism conceived precisely to maintain its conformity with non-fictional usage at the cost of detaching it in one way or another from its actual communicative context. As Walsh argues, the qualities of fiction cannot be fully described formally. The important framing move decouples fiction from ontological categories and sets the foundation for a conception of fictionality as an experiential phenomenon afforded by a text or cybertext that takes place between reader, viewer, player, and the text, rather than as a formal property of the latter. Werner Woolf takes a related perspective on fictionality, emphasizing its experiential nature and the importance of considering what Ryan calls the decentering of the reader, viewer, or player. Woolf calls this operation of fictionality the aesthetic illusion, which he describes as the feeling of being recentered in a possible world as if it were a slice of life, a feeling that prevails in spite of the fact and our latent awareness of it, and this impression is triggered by a mere artifact. Now, I've been kind of rapidly jumping across those for a reason. After we considered all of this carefully, Ivan and I have to confess that we were coming away a little bit underwhelmed. Even when we looked at the work of figures like Ruth Ronan, Dalzell, Cohn, Palmer, and so on, all of whom address the way in which the reader, user, or viewer might interact with fictional minds in heterocosmica or fictional universes, we were coming away with a slight but nagging sense of dissatisfaction. We had hit a wall.
We could see that we would always snag on a difficulty that has dogged formalist and structuralist analysis since the days of Propp, Gramash, Genet, and others. Roland Barthes had fallen upon it too. Barthes had himself operated as a structuralist, notably with works like Elements of Semiology. But in his book As Z, a book which analyzed Balzac's Sarracine in close structuralist detail, he provided both an apotheosis of structuralist method and a satire of it. He realized that elusive and singular works, and they are always in fact multiple, might always undo the most carefully constructed models and taxonomies. Todorov had the same intuition in his book Poetics of Prose, including when he was studying typologies of detective fiction, no less, which on the face of it is as straightforwardly patternable as any genre. And of course, waiting in the wings was Derrida, whose probing critique of structuralist thought would become decisive. It seemed timely, therefore, to try to apply Derrida's thought to structuralist predilections in game studies, not least because it happens to be, almost exactly to the day, the 50th anniversary when in Baltimore, at Johns Hopkins, Derrida rose to give the address that would become known as Structure, Sign and Play in the Discourse of the Human Sciences, an essay that has been described as exploding the structuralist paradigm. And yet, even here, there are potential problems. Derrida himself was famously resistant to the notion that his thought could be applied. This book, Applying to Derrida, contains essays explaining the pitfalls involved in applying Derridian thought to anything while still making the attempt. Okay, so we thought, why not have a go? We could therefore try, we thought, to reverse the usual directions of commentary. The move would be not to apply Derrida's thought in a reading of a game or games, but rather to hold philosophy, or this area of philosophy, to account, through looking at what games might yield as limit texts for post-structuralism's operations. In other words, we'd try to apply games to a reading of Derrida rather than the other way around. In a second step, however, we would still ask what sort of game might serve as the kind of philosophical fiction to think with. After all, post-structuralist philosophy's formulations have often been predicated on close reading of a fictional text seen to have quasi-allegorical significance for epistemology and its discontents. In a third step, we would reflect on how much significance should be imputed to the fact that post-structuralist catalogues may no longer define the scene of the action in contemporary thought, whereas games are very now. In much the same way that, as Mark Poster understood, Derridian characterization of the practice of writing is problematized in a time of electronic writing. Games must, by analogy, presumably come with a high coefficient of contemporaneity, so to speak. And this coefficient could potentially trouble any application of Derridian thought that was not prepared to think that difference through. These then would be the bare bones of the plan, those three steps. Let us try to think with you, however, some of the difficulties that this plan presents. To be sure, work like this would need to have some prior sense of an inventory, as it were, of those areas within Derridian thought that are amenable to being applied to a reading of digital games. And in this respect, the pickings could be rich. We could all have a grand old time talking about how Derridian concepts like deference, the trace, supplementarity, aporia, archie-writing, the logic of the signature, the nature of iteration, the experience of death, dying, and post-death, how all of those can be applied to games. But again, there would be pitfalls. For instance, to go back to the question of fiction, a sentence like the following from Derrida appears to register not only an affinity with the idea of the aesthetic illusion, but in effect a restatement of it. The sentence goes, "The practice of fiction always runs the risk of believing in it or having us believe in it." This sentence from Derrida's The Truth in Painting can seem like it must be embedded with an extended reflection on the nature of the fictive. But in fact, in its context, what it does is to set up a cautionary note. The practice of fiction, Derrida warns, must therefore guard against having metaphysical truth palmed off on it once under the label of fiction. For the context in Truth in Painting is in fact a study on the nature of ergon and parergon in art, on the relation between the work and what is outside the work, and on the forcible bringing to relation of both. What this example indicates is that it is too easy to impute relevance to work in philosophy, in this case Derrida's, that predates a practice, in this case games, in which that philosophy could have had no real investment, even of the unwittingly prefiguring kind. This is the same as when one tries to apply the Kantian understanding of the sublime in investigations of the postmodern condition. It can't really work, which is why Lyotard went on to write lessons on the analytic of the sublime, about precisely how and why it couldn't. In the effort to affirm for games congruities with discourses within the humanities that can help to confer readier effects of institutional legitimation, it becomes tempting to read within games the operativity of paradigms and of the refashioning associable with anyone from Aristotle to Agamben or from Zeno to Zizek. The very sentence just quoted from Derrida about fiction's plausibilities and the warning against palming off some deeper truth or underlying relation upon any form of fiction, within whose categories we can now include games, stresses that. But, yet again, and paradoxically, Derrida's critical practice seems to flout his very admonition. For one of his characteristic modes of argumentation is to find within fiction the ground on which to have a philosophy evolve. Such an example is what he did with the apparition scenes, the scenes with the ghost, in Shakespeare's Hamlet, as Derrida commented on spectropoetics and hauntology in his book Spectres of Mars. It's what he did with short stories by Maurice Blanchot, where the narrators are dead, as Derrida elaborated ideas on the autothanatographical. Accordingly, in the essay Demeure, an essay which is a reading of Blanchot's story The Instant of My Death, in which a narrator who feels he might as well be dead, even if he was reprieved from death by firing squad, in looking at that story, Derrida reflects upon fiction in the context of thinking upon literariness, the problems of testimony, and mutually countering laws within literature and reality. This interest of Derrida in fiction occurs also in essays like those collected in Without Alibi, where he worries away at fiction's status in a spectrum that also contains the actions of lying and perjury. For a conference like ours about knowledge, the implications hardly need spelling out, but we shall spell out just one framing question anyway. How can knowledge be arrived at through fiction? Derrida, as we know, liked his play with fiction. Knowledge, truth, logocentrism, all of these are famously open to the construction in Derrida's philosophy, and often very playfully so. But fiction, which in his thinking he cannot but associate with literature, sets us no easy corrective or counter. Hence Derrida's view that, quote, there is no testimony that does not at least structurally imply in itself the possibility of fiction, simulacra, the simulation, lie, and perjury. That is to say, the possibility of literature. That's his words. If testimony, he continues, thereby become proof, information, certainty, or archive, it would lose its function as testimony. For Derrida, Blanchot's The Instant of My Death, the importance of this story lies in its dramatization of this problematic within fiction, which is why he reads it as closely as he does. In the way Derrida strategizes things, Blanchot's The Instant of My Death is a literary fiction to demonstrate yet deconstruct and deconstruct with fiction. By analogy, might the question to ask here be, what game might be thought of to demonstrate yet deconstruct and deconstruct with fiction in its game's defined forms? What furniture would Jesus pick, goes the title of one of Annie Proulx's short stories. In the same spirit, we could ask, what game would Derrida play-read if he were still around and could take his pick of platform? It's a stupid question, of course. For all its facileness, however, the question is irresistible. Is there a game that can figure a philosophy? Of course there is, you will say, many of them. So why do we have the impression that philosophy in its mainstream discourse is not playing the game of playing games? Not by and large, anyway. Is there a game that could stand at the center of, say, a Derridian allegorizing reading, on which broader perspectives about truth, knowledge, or just the way things are can be set? What truth about fiction, about the way we live and read now, might such a game be thereby seen to convey? But again, the question is vulnerable. Worse, it is slavish. For why would game studies play this gambit of mirroring with games what other discourse do in the gap left by those discourse when they don't play games? It's beginning to seem to us that game studies works a little short of the nerve to feel that as a discipline it can call philosophy to account. It continues to place itself open to audit by philosophical categories that it may in fact be well programmed to unsettle. For the record, because we must also say this, if we were to nominate a game text that could arguably do similar work for game studies that Blanchot's Récit did for the construction, then it would probably be The Beginner's Guide, by the same author of the Stanley Parable, we might note. It was always some kind of parable we were likely to be looking for, wasn't it? A parable on metafictionality, if you like, on structures and metastructures of presence and absence. Which brings us to our final move in this paper, back to Derrida's deeply influential essay, Structure, Silent Play, the Discourse of the Human Sciences. When it was delivered at Johns Hopkins in 1966, it was as part of a landmark conference called The Languages of Criticism and the Sciences of Man. What role can games play in approaching the so-called sciences of man differently? In our time, would the sciences of man be more aptly designed in terms of the post-humanities, to use a term that has been much bandied about? Is that where games' special place in the sciences of man might now feature? Possibly. But that would need, Gordon and I figured, some searching rethinking of various critical reflexes, pieties, orthodoxies. In preparation for this paper, and before we realized we were being ridiculous, he and I spent a good few hours working through Structure, Silent Play scrupulously. There we were, looking for reinterpretation and reapplication for the words of game studies. Diligently, we wondered how the center might be reconceptualized in a games-aware paradigm, to which self-evidently structure, sign, play, their interrelations and their codependence are not only critical but also constitutive, even more so than with any other articulation, discourse or practice. But the effort was misguided even though it was fascinating. The fascination arose because it was useful to think about the nature of, for instance, code and its challenges to the linguistic turn, or the rekeying of code of the hermeneutics of doubt in relation to the transcendental signified. It was useful to read Structure, Sign and Play against Catherine Hales's landmark essay, Traumas of Code, which announces the end of the linguistic turn in much the same way that Derrida's essay marked the end of the structuralist turn. Hales's essay begins, "Language is not what it used to be." And it was perhaps not excessively glib to move from critiques of the operations of the stylus in texts like Derrida's of Grammatology and Spurs onto typewriter ribbons and word processing as discussed in his books Paper Machine and Without Alibi, and to ask if he would ever have moved on to this as an agent of writing reinscription agency. And yet we realized we were missing the point. For the whole point, we thought, is that what Structure, Sign and Play did was to study the non-equivalence between, on the one hand, a particular moment in knowledge, an awareness of crisis in prevailing epistemes, and on the other, the philosophers and philosophies, the understandings of paradigms and textual settlements that could only partially provide the figure of and for that time. 50 years later, as we study games and philosophy and the terms for their encounters, we might wish to remember that what Derrida was attempting in Structure, Sign and Play was a critique of a prevailing conception upon knowledge in his time. It was from the space of just such a critique, there and in other texts, that he later proceeded to read fiction, literature. Quite simply, he felt that he had to know his time better, as well as its understanding of the systematicity of its own understanding of knowledge as it stood then, before he could go on to read the fictions of that time or its tropes and move to deconstruct them. In conclusion, what Gordon and I have come to feel is that if there is anything to take at all from Derrida's turn upon post-structuralist philosophy from structuralist thought, it is not the application of any terms, philosophies, or protocols of post-structuralist reading to the analysis of games. That's a worthy exercise, but it's the broader implications and stakes that interest us. And so, rather, what might need to be analogously done in game studies and with some urgency is not the next landmark reading of whatever game according to whichever philosophy's paradigms, nor is it advocacy for whatever next approach, methodology, or philosophy within current knowledge seems most viable in a retooling of game studies. No doubt, in game studies there are newish amenabilities to newish paradigms, and it is entirely right that the discernibility of both should be recognized and their affinities mutually repurposed. But the more enabling and open question first, irresolvable though it is to ask, as Derrida did then before he did any such work, with the epistemological, critical and fictional discourses and practices of his time, it is to ask, what is this time? How are we thinking it differently? How and why might we think it differently? Or, if you like, how are we to play this time differently? In that wager, games and game studies, their knowledges and their fictions have their place. It is all a question, however, of reading our knowledge of our time before we study the games of that time, or its notification. Thank you.
Thank you very much. I'm sure there will be questions.
Thank you very much to the both of you. Very, in my opinion, provocative and complicated to take in just from listening to you, so I will definitely debate that. But from my understanding currently, it seems that you sort of take a stance to writing and understanding games, right? And taking different positions in culture to write and understand games. From my own perspective, like, it seems that can you still hear me? Yeah, okay. It's missing the possibility not only to write and understand games, but also write and understand games. How do I explain this? Write and understand not about games, but through games. So right now it seems that you're taking like a textual, post-structuralist, and structuralist and post-structuralist approach to game as an object, but not as the means of writing, and not as the means of understanding. I wonder if I misunderstood, or is that a part of your research that tackles that?
Okay, I might probably need to rephrase aspects of the paper. I think that's a fair question. We're very concerned about not simply working with using Derrida or Lyotard or Stigler to read games, because we feel that there is a reversal to that process that can be worked. It might be possible to discern something within games and indeed within play that unsettles just a little even these philosophies, even these theories, which invest so much, ironically, in ideas of the unreliable, the ambiguous, the undecidable, that we heard so much about in such an interesting way in this morning's keynote. And therefore, the gambit of bringing in structure, sign and play to discourse of the human sciences as a text to read is ironic. There's situational irony there, because here is the essay that played the game of taking structuralism on its own terms and then asking the question of, in Derrida's phrase, the structurality of structure. So it becomes very, very tempting to look at the structurality of games. Again, the link with this morning's keynote is evident there. And it becomes all too easy and predictable for a post-structuralist, firmly keeping his hat on his post-structuralist head, to say, we should probably deconstruct the notion of systematicity of games and just undo this a little bit. But it might be that that the challenge that games bring is precisely to make that deconstructive instinct stop and think, because games probably demonstrate just why we need systematicity now, before we can go on to understand the possibilities of their own unreliability and ambiguity.
So my question currently stands outside of the sort of pseudo-ironical critique.
Yes, we need to come to earnestness in a later paper.
Thank you.
Yeah, thanks for that talk. I said yes when you were asking your question, because I was wondering about the similar things. And it's probably not only in Germany, but since I was trained there, I have it from there. Structure, sign, and play is usually also being read as the change from representation to performativity. Right, so it's not about like representing something, but doing something. So Derrida's language is so difficult because it's not really about what he says, but what he is doing while trying to say something. So, and then we have in Germany, we have that system theorist, Niklas Luhmann, who actually said Derrida invented nothing else but the observer of the second order to some extent, which again leads back to Bateson, because Luhmann partly has his ideas also from Bateson. So I wonder in which way, ideas of Bateson actually are present in what you're saying.
Okay, to start off with the question of performativity first. Yes, that's absolutely vital. And in fact, the longer version of the paper contains a reflection, for example, about a book like Knowl, which undoes ideas of absolute knowledge. It's a conference on knowledge, so of course we felt that that had to be looked at. And it's something that is also carried through in texts like the postcard and so on. So the performativity of the construction is, in some respects, one of its most annoying things, but it's also one of its most honest things. You could see why Derrida had to carry it through. And it would be extremely interesting to see what a game that operated according to supposedly the constructive, I don't even want to say the word principles, but the constructive mindset, what shape might such a game take. That part of your question is, I think, vital. The second part was about human. And I'm familiar with that distinction within the gambit in which the Luhmann-Derrida conflict, so to speak, is played back within posthumanism. Carrie Wolf does some very interesting work with that. We have not arrived at that stage in our thinking yet, although in our discussions we have started to probe what one would do with a book like Social Systems in the broader frame of the project. Nor have we really looked at Bateson. Nor have we really looked at Bateson. And the problem with Bateson is that he's starting to become suddenly really important in game studies. Perhaps even more so following the publication of Tim Parks' novel Dream of River and Seas. Parks does a lot of interesting work with him, even in his recent book, the novel A Survival Skill. But that's work to come in our case.
I think that the basics about self-reference.
Yes, but before our discussion gets too self-referential, if you can formulate your question and the reply as one sentences, we can have it now, or I would ask you to take it to lunch, because we're a bit behind time.
Well, I would like to go even a little bit further back in history, so to say. And I was also thinking, linking also to the keynote of today. And this notion of only showing fragments, for example, is also closely connected to what I talked about as Schelling and the absolute, that the absolute cannot be represented. And for that reason, you can only show fragments. And one of the key stylistic elements of Romanticism is also showing fragments and evoking the totality, but which never can be represented by the finite, so to say. And there has been written a very nice book still, I think, by Manfred Frank in 1984, I think, Was heißt Neostructuralismus, where he connects Derrida to Schleiermacher. Because in Schleiermacher's hermeneutics, it's all about the question, hermeneutics starts where we do not understand and where we cannot understand. And it's not so much that hermeneutics always is aiming at the totality, but is starting from not knowing things and being puzzled by things. So in that sense, I think you can read Derrida as a kind of bad consciousness of hermeneutics, but always presupposes it in a certain sense. And one last remark about, also linking up with what Stefano was saying. What is interesting, in also connecting to the performativity, games do something. For example, it's undecidability in practice, not so much talking about it, but showing it in many respects, and that's the interesting thing. I once wrote an article about Nintendo explained for lovers of René, the filmer, because what the Nouvelle Vague filmers wanted to do was give me movies that are not the kind of like a Hollywood movie, giving the whole structure to making everything clear to the viewer, but to make the viewer active in concern. But they failed in a way, and nobody went to those movies. Even in Paris, René, after 2 weeks, the cinemas were empty, because you were not really active as a viewer, even when they tried to deconstruct the story in a way. But games, Nintendo, that was the line in my article, Nintendo puts in practice what these movie makers try to conceive conceptually, but not in practice, so to say. So there is a whole kind of genealogy, I think, going back from discussions around games nowadays, that can gain a lot from this long history, I think. It's more a remark than a question in a way.
Okay, as that was a remark, I would just like to thank our first speakers